Tehran's main shopping bazaar reopened today after days of protests that rattled the clerical leadership. The demonstrations driven by the country's deteriorating economy, especially the plunging value of its currency. As you can see in this chart, the rial, under pressure from the threat of U.S. sanctions, took a sharp dive in April after the regime attempted to unify the exchange rate and limited the amount of hard currency that can actually be held by the average Iranian citizen.
Protesters have specifically attacked the regime's spending in the Syrian war and its foreign aid to groups like Hezbollah and the Palestinians. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei weighed in today on Twitter, saying, "Today, propaganda and complicated PR methods are used to depict black as white and absolute falsehood as truth. We need to act firmly against the enemy, the spiteful, conspirators and accusers, while showing humbleness, sympathy, and love to people, treating them on mutual understanding." Well, joining us from our D.C. studio is Washington correspondent for the Iran International, Negar Mortazavi. Negar, let me just ask you, we saw the downtick in the demonstrations there today in Iran. Where do you see it going forward?
Well, I think the economic grievances are not going anywhere, even if the protests sort of decrease. And it's also not just mere protests. This was some closing or basically a move by the main holders in the Iranian bazaar, which is an important move. It's reminiscent of certain moves by the same group, by the bazaris that happened before, closer to the Iranian Revolution. So the psychological impact of these kind of protests in the bazaar are huge. But at the same time, it seems like the administration, at least when we hear the statements from President Rouhani, it seems like the administration is trying to find a solution for it. What he has been pushing for is some form of unity within the political system. There's been a lot of political infightings, some of which contributed to the increase in these kind of protests. But it just seems like the administration is trying to control the situation, the crisis. It's trying to control it. This issue of the currency devaluation is really, really important. It's really taking a toll on the economy, and we just have to wait and see how they're going to deal with it going forward with the increasing pressure of U.S. sanctions also.
Negar, you mentioned they're trying to rein it in. Rouhani, as usual, sort of the one saying a sort of more moderate, protester-friendly statement. But statements like the one we heard, several tweets really from the Supreme Leader today, traditional Iranian regime statements blaming the media, blaming propaganda, enemies of Iran. Is the Iranian public buying that? The Iranian public that has an economy around them that is tanking?
Well, part of what is going, I feel like there's this kind of war of words happening from both sides. We also saw a statement from Secretary Pompeo today blaming the Iranian government for corruption, for mismanagement, and for wasting Iran's assets and resources outside the country. All of these are true to some extent, but what the U.S. government side is leaving out of the equation is the pressure of U.S. sanctions. And what the Iranians, especially more specifically, as you mentioned, the Supreme Leader, is only focusing on is the sort of outside pressure that's coming in. But to say or to believe that the protests are actually started by outside sources, that they're led by outside sources, is not very, we haven't seen any kind of evidence for that. They could be encouraged by the outside, by specifically the Trump administration, by these kind of statements and everything that's coming, and also the pressure of sanction that is definitely taking their toll on the economy. But the economic grievances on the ground are pretty genuine. It's something that even within the political establishment has been acknowledged by people, and there's been these discussions, even public discussions, on how they need to find ways and solutions to fix them and not only blame them on each other. But then at the same time, the pressure that's from the outside, mainly from the sanctions, is not something to be overlooked, and it's definitely hurting the Iranian economy at the same time.
Negar, as I mentioned, apparently some of the demonstrators are specifically criticizing the government for funding, spending billions on the war in Syria, for funding groups like Hezbollah and the Palestinians, while domestic spending seems to have decreased dramatically. Does that message get through to the regime, or is it just so focused on achieving its gains in the region that they're just going to ignore those calls?
These kind of, I would say, criticisms or protests to the foreign policy, especially in the region of the establishment, have been ongoing, and they surface at every protest. And again, as I said, there are legitimate concerns, there are economic concerns that people are worried that these resources are being spent outside on foreign policy, a lot of them, while there's an economic crisis inside the country. But at the same time, Iran's strategic, basically the foreign policy that they've been following in the region, and their strategy basically in the region doesn't seem to have changed so much, especially now coming the type of pressure that's coming from the U.S. and its allies in the region. It just seems like it's giving an upper hand, at least when it comes to foreign policy, to the Iranian hardliners, and it's putting them, putting the entire groups more sort of in a corner that might even led them and us to see an escalation in these types of policies.
Well,
and listening to the criticism that's just coming from the populace, we haven't seen much of that happening.
Negar, this is far from the first time. I mean, Iran is no stranger to protests. It's not the first time that economic woes are driving it. What do you think, from your vantage point, will be the straw that could break the regime's back, so to speak, or is just protest after protest with no real change?
As you said, we have seen protests. These protests are not comparable to what we saw in 2009. We saw massive protests, millions on the street in 2009, and it wasn't just economic, it was pure political after the presidential election in 2009. And the protests, they almost continued up until a year after, but the regime basically was able to crack down and wrap them up, and we didn't see a breakup or any sort of fundamental threat to the establishment. So these kind of protests, as far as we have seen in the experience of the Islamic Republic, are not going to be basically a fundamental threat to the actual establishment. But then at the same time, there's infightings, like I said, there's political infightings within the groups in the establishment. And also this kind of dissent coming from the populace is going to definitely put some pressure, and they need to come up with solutions to continue to change the status quo, basically, and not continue this way.